All right, guys, so this is kind of an intro to JSX. If you already know everything about JSX and fragments and so on, you can pretty much skip this video. But for those of you that don't, this here that we're returning from our render looks like HTML, but it's actually something called JSX, which is JavaScript Syntax Extension. And it's basically syntactic sugar to be able to write the output of our component in an XML or HTML-like way. Under the hood, this is actually JavaScript, and I'm going to show you exactly what this looks like as JavaScript. You don't technically need to use JSX, but you're going to save yourself a ton of time and a ton of code by using JSX for your output. All right, now there's a couple differences between HTML and JSX, and one of them is pretty, you probably already realize that, and that's this right here, class name. So basically, when we want to use a class within JSX, we use class name instead. If I go ahead and use class, it will actually render, but over here you'll see the warning, invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? And you can run into some issues. So you want to use class name instead of class. Another one is the for attribute. So let's say you have a label and you say for name, something like that, and you can see I get the same type of warning, and what we're supposed to use is HTML4. Okay, so you would change for to HTML4 like that. So those are the two main attributes that you have to remember. I don't use for that much, but class, there's a lot of times where I do forget, especially if you're taking a UI and you're turning it into React and you copy and paste it in. You have to remember to change all the classes to class name. All right, so that's JSX. Now, I want to show you how we can, actually before we get into that, I just want to mention one thing that's very important, and that is that your JSX has to have one parent element. See how we're returning one div here? It always has to be one element. So if I go down here and I put in H2, and we'll say goodbye, notice that we get a linting error right away that says expressions must have one parent element. We get a warning down here, or an error down here, and also if we go to our browser, our application doesn't even show anymore. It just says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Okay, we have something called fragments as well, which I'll get into in a second. So if we want to have an H2, we just need to put it inside that parent div. If I save that, then everything works and we don't have a problem. So just remember, it has to have one parent element. Now, there might be times where you don't want an actual div rendered in the DOM, because if we look at our rendered HTML here, we have a div with the class of app, and then an H1 and an H2. Okay, the root is just wrapped around everything. Ignore that. I'm just looking at this particular component which has this div. Now we might not want this, and we might not want any div right here, just the H1 and H2. In that case, we can use a fragment. So I could replace this with react.fragment, and now if I go back, you'll see that our H1 and H2 are no longer wrapped in that div. Okay, it's just the H1 and H2. So it's almost like a ghost element. It's an element in terms of JSX, but the rendered output isn't going to show anything. All right, and a lot of times what I'll do is just bring in fragment up here so that I don't have to do react.fragment. That'll work as well. And another way you could do it is just get rid of this completely and just use angle brackets. That will also work. If we go back, you'll see that we get nothing around our H1 and H2. Now, I don't do this empty angle brackets, because in certain situations you can run into issues. Also, I don't really like the look of it. I rather use the fragment, so that's what we'll be doing through the course. All right, so let's see, we've gone over fragments. I'm just going to put this back to a div with a class name and an H1, because I want to show you what this would look like without JSX. So I'm going to go ahead and just temporarily delete this and just use straight JavaScript. So we could take our React that we brought in up here from the React library, and there's a method called createElement. So anytime you want to render out any element, you would use this. We want a div, and you don't have to do this. I'm just showing you an example. Second parameter is any attributes you want. In our case, we had a class name of app. And then the third is going to be what you want inside that element. So inside this div, we had an h1. Now, since h1 is a whole nother element, we again need to do react.createElement. We need to pass in what element it is, which is an h1. We had no attributes, so we'll put null. And then the content within the h1 was hello from React. And if I save that, Prettier is just going to, format it a little bit. So this will give us the same exact output without JSX. Now, this might not look too bad, but imagine if you had, a ton of markup here with all different expressions and attributes and props and stuff like that. It would get really messy. So this is why pretty much everyone uses JSX. All right, but I'm just going to undo all that. Just wanted to give you an idea of what it would look like without JSX. All right, so in the next video, we're going to take a look at expressions. Right now, we just have, static markup in our return here. I want to show you that we can put in variables and expressions and conditionals and all that stuff. So we'll get into that in the next video.